Well, I'll start by thanking Kieran and everybody here at the Irish Linen Centre and Lisbon Museum for inviting me, and of course to all of you for coming along. Thank you very much for being here on such a cold night, and I do appreciate it. I have had a fascinating time, I have to say, seeing some of the museum here. And it's good to get the chance to talk about my grandfather. When I was about 8, and my mother told me that her father had been killed in the Spanish Civil War, I was too young to understand what the Spanish Civil War was, but old enough to sense the inconsolable grief that she was still living with at that time. And you could say that my mysterious missing grandfather cast a shadow over my childhood, and my wish to piece his story together began at that time. Robert Hilliard was only 32 when he died, but I learnt that as years went by, that in that short time he had many incarnations. He was a student of ancient Greek and Latin literature, an Olympic boxer, a journalist, a Church of Ireland clergyman, and I would say a reforming Church of Ireland clergyman. He was somebody who wanted to change the Church of Ireland for the better, and in general to change life for his parishioners for the better. He was an anti-fascist activist in London and an international brigadista in Spain. And my book tries to bring this wild and colourful character to life. Sometimes I get asked why I called it Swift Blaze of Fire. And the title comes from a poem by Irish poet Brendan Behan, which some of you will know, which begins, "I see this bad old order die in one swift blaze of fire." And my mother, she's 97 now, she's Robert Hilliard's last surviving child, she liked the poem as soon as I read it to her. "That's what he was like," she said to me. "You should make that the title, because he was like a swift blaze of fire." Another reason was that Brendan Behan's poem is also a revolutionary poem about the need to get rid of a corrupt, war-mongering, imperialist world order and replace it with something better. And that was the view of things that Robert Hilliard carried into Spain. And so it's the point of view from which the book is written. What I plan to do tonight is speak for about 40 minutes, giving an outline of my grandfather Robert Hilliard's life, showing the twists and turns in his story, showing how his values were shaped by the times he lived in, the history he lived through, and the struggles of his times, very turbulent part of history, and what took him to Spain, how he ended up there, finishing by saying why I do believe that his story and the stories of people like him are so important to us now. The book's in 6 sections, so I'm going to take each section and tell you a little bit about that part of Hilliard's life. And there are some slides. I'm afraid they're not chronologically spaced through his life, but they do give you a sort of visual accompaniment to some key moments in his life. So to start with part 1, I'm going to try and answer 2 questions. Who were Robert's family and what had they wanted him to be? So there they are, the Hilliards. An aspirational family who regarded themselves as very much on the way up the social ladder. They ran a boot and shoe factory in Killarney and also a shop. And by the time Robert was born in 1904, the Hilliard business was the single biggest employer in Killarney. Robert's father, who I'll call Robert Senior, had been dragged back very unwillingly from Trinity College Dublin, where he was studying the classics, and he really had wanted an academic life. And he had to come back and run the business for family reasons, which I go into in the book. And because of this, he felt a very disappointed man, and he tutored his son, Robert was his eldest son, in the classics from a very early age. In fact, from infancy, he was a very little boy when he started learning Greek and Latin, because his father wanted him to carry out his own thwarted ambitions. And as many of you will know, this was a period of intense social upheaval the world that Robert Hilliard Sr. was preparing his son to enter was a disappearing world. So, as I say, immense social upheaval with mass strikes known as the Great Unrest in 1911, the Dublin Lockout in 1913, the Ulster Volunteers marching and drilling against Home Rule in 1913, and the Irish Volunteers marching and drilling in response in the South, demanding Home Rule and in many cases going further and demanding full-blown Irish independence. And against this increasingly tense political background, and with World War I already raging, Robert, aged 11, in this picture he's aged about 10, so about a year later, he was scooped up and sent off to Cork Grammar School in January 1916. And he was told that he must study hard, that he must go to Trinity College Dublin, get a degree in classics, and then become a professional of some kind or a clergyman. But the things Robert witnessed, young Robert witnessed and experienced while in Cork from 1916 to 1920, and later on at Mountjoy School in Dublin from 1920 to 1921, shaped his thinking and his politics for life, not in ways that his parents expected. This picture shows Irish volunteers marching through Cork on St. Patrick's Day in 1916. Cork was a place of appalling hardship in World War I. The streets were full of injured soldiers and the hungry and the homeless. 1 in 8 Cork children died in infancy. There were terrible food shortages. There was blatant war profiteering. Nobody was allowed to voice criticism of the war effort or of British rule in Ireland because that was against the law under the Defence of the Realm Act. But although Cork looked like a loyal city with Union Jacks fluttering everywhere, and they really were fluttering everywhere if you look at old movies from the time, big cracks were appearing. For example, on St. Patrick's Day, here we have it, 1916, for the first time ever, no British Army contingent was permitted to march in the annual St. Patrick's Day parade. Their place was taken by Irish volunteers marching with rifles and pikes. So you can look at this picture and imagine a band playing somewhere in the procession and the boys in the school well within earshot, hearing the band, and for the first time they would not be hearing British tunes. And this was obviously presaging things to come. And this is Robert at home with his sisters at Easter, the Easter holidays 1916, and his young brother is sitting on the lap of the eldest sister, Moll. And we have some of Moll's descendants here tonight, so I'm very happy to see them in the audience. What's the one in the front there, the biggest girl? So he was at home in Killarney for the Easter holidays, and that's where he was when the Easter Rising kicked off. Part of the Easter Rising plan was that guns would be landed at Feenet Harbour, about 30 miles from Killarney, but as we know, the ship was intercepted by the British authorities. And so while the Easter Rising was raging in Dublin, Robert saw police and soldiers trooping around Killarney, arresting people. And after he went back to school in Cork, the executions of the rising leaders started in Dublin. One executed man was Thomas Kent, who lived in Cork, and he hadn't taken part in the Rising. And he was shot in Victoria Barracks in Cork, just up the hill from the school. So the boys may well have heard the firing squad because it's really quite close. And there was a serious backlash against these executions across Ireland, and the whole atmosphere changed in Cork. And then another seminal event in 1917, the Russian Revolution, news of that spread around the world, and it transformed the Irish labour movement. And there was a wave of mass strikes which affected everyone's lives, including the boys in the school. Everything was disrupted, the trams, food deliveries, almost every place of business was disrupted at one time or another. There was a very successful general strike in April 1918, which stopped the government from conscripting Irish men and sending them to the Western Front, which was, a conscription act had just been passed to conscript Irish men. But that did not go ahead after this huge strike. And it showed, that these strikes were having a big effect. And it posed a genuine danger to the Allied war effort, because if these strikes had spread to the UK or to the colonies, it wouldn't have been possible to go on fighting the war. So the reaction of the British government was to, this has to be stopped, this has to be repressed. They sent 12,000 troops to Ireland, and in due course, as we all know, two paramilitary forces, the Black and Tans and the auxiliaries, arrived, and the Irish War of Independence became increasingly militarised on both sides. But despite the brutality, I will call it that, of the occupying forces, the strikes continued and strengthened until British rule looked decidedly shaky, and there are some interesting quotations about this in the book, written at the time. By 1919, strike committees were running whole cities, such as Limerick and Belfast, for weeks together. There was a strike committee more or less administered affairs in Belfast for 3 weeks in 1919. The Irish workers' movement was mounting a serious challenge to the British state. I spent some time in Cork when I was researching the book, and I explored the neighbourhood of Robert's school. And I'm sure some of you know Cork. Sydney Place is just off St Patrick's Hill, just uphill and along from the main railway station, which is where the big demonstrations often began in those days, and roughly parallel to King Street, which is now McCurtain Street. And these big marches and the bands playing and people shouting and chanting. Sometimes there would be shots, sometimes the RIC would be wanting to crack down on the march, and there'd be tremendous mayhem. And the boys were within earshot of this. There was no way they didn't hear this. Round the corner from the school was an RIC station where Black and Tans were also eventually stationed. For Hilliard and his schoolfellows, the hubbub of revolt and the reprisals by Crown forces were happening all around them. Also, at one point, the IRA broke into the school and stole all the guns from the Officers' Training Corps. So that's a good story, which you would have to, I recommend that you read the book so that you can read the rest of it. Later on, when Robert went on to Mountjoy School in Dublin, not that far from Croke Park, definitely again within earshot of Croke Park, the scene of Bloody Sunday, which happened while Robert was at the school. The boys would have heard the firing and the screams. Once again, he was located in the very heart of a city at war, and for this young and impressionable boy, it was an intensely disturbing experience to be living in two cities torn apart by war, away from his family year after year, and in turn it tore him apart from the loyalism of his parents and shaped the man he became. I believe it was while he was at home for the holidays during his time at Mountjoy School in Dublin that his family were visited by an IRA unit demanding food, and it was Robert who took charge of feeding them, which is another story that you'd have to read the details of in the book. He didn't disappoint his father. He worked very hard at school. He got his scholarship to Trinity College, but by the time he started there in 1921, aged only 17, he had become an ardent Irish nationalist who wanted to see his country free from British rule. And part 3 of the book, which sadly I don't have a slide for, is about his time as a student at Trinity College Dublin between 1921 and the end of 1925. He was a lively, roistering student with strong political opinions and a love of arguing. He gave dozens of speeches at Trinity's debating societies, and although it's very clear that his political ideas about class were still unformed, by the end of his first term, he'd established himself as a committed nationalist who was all for Irish freedom from British rule and strongly against imperialism. And he wasn't just against imperialism in Ireland, as he was also, he spoke at debates about the need for Egyptian independence, the British were in Egypt at the time, and he spoke against this. He compared Egypt with Ireland. He pointed to the fact that the French and the British were carving up the Middle East between them. This was there's a few years after the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which some of you will have heard of, was signed. A secret agreement, but news of it was starting to leak out by this time. Basically, the French and the British carved up the Middle East to basically control the flow of oil. And he predicted that there was going to be another world war. So Robert Hilliard was quite on the ball politically in predicting that. In December 1921, the treaty to end the Irish War of Independence was signed between Sinn Féin and the British government. For the Irish Labour movement and for Irish Republicans, the treaty had many drawbacks, not least that it partitioned the North from the South. James Connolly had predicted that if there was partition, it would lead to a carnival of reaction. And indeed, as partition was set in place, the country did split between those who supported the treaty and those who opposed it. And horrendous pogroms against Catholics began in the North. In fact, Robert's father and uncles signed a petition against these dreadful pogroms down in Killarney. There was absolute horror at some of the atrocities that were carried out at this time. And at the same time, leading figures in Sinn Féin began to clamp down on the Irish workers' movement in the South. Robert argued against the treaty from the start, which was a brave stand to take in Trinity College Dublin at that time. Didn't find a lot of people agreeing with him, and he was a young rebel in other ways too. He always spoke up in debates against conservatism, against stuffiness, in favour of modernity. I felt I learned a lot from reading reports of his contributions to debates about what he was like, not just about his politics, but about his energy, his tremendous enthusiasm, his humour, his very personal take on the classical texts that he had to study, his wild personality and his zest for life. What happened at the end of 1922? Because he suddenly began to turn away from debating and became a boxer. And I think the answer to the question, what happened, is the Irish Civil War. Essentially, this was an agonisingly violent counter-revolution. The British government gave field guns and weaponry to the pro-treaty side and told them that if they didn't want a full-scale invasion, they must suppress the anti-treaty side, and that's what they did. But they weren't just defeating the anti-treaty wing of Sinn Féin. In the process, the newly emerging Irish state also suppressed the Irish labour movement. Using British armaments, they crushed all the strikes and occupations and self-styled Soviets, as they called themselves, across the south of Ireland. The optimism and hope for a new Ireland that had characterised the earlier stages of the Irish Revolution dissolved in a wave of nightmarish violence, which would ultimately establish a very conservative, anti-worker, misogynist regime in Ireland, dominated by what I would describe as a very right-wing form of Catholicism. There's some evidence that Robert purloined weapons from the Trinity College Officers Training Corps at this time and passed them to the anti-treaty side. However, he also made a debating speech robustly denouncing the conduct of both sides. So although he supported the anti-treatyites, he didn't necessarily approve of the way that they were fighting the war. As the Civil War dragged on, he became very demoralised. His debating contributions became extremely pessimistic. And during 1923, he stopped debating altogether and he turned to boxing. So part 4 is about his boxing career. I wish I had a picture to show you of Robert Hilliard as a boxer. There is one in the book, but it's not a very good one. So I haven't made a slide of it. But I have to say I really enjoyed researching and writing this part of the book. He was very good at boxing. Within a year, he'd become All-Ireland Amateur Bantamweight Champion, All-Ireland Amateur Featherweight Champion, and he charmed people in the ring. You can tell this from the newspaper reports of his fights, by making it an entertaining performance. And he was a very dogged fighter. This is always commented on. In early 1924, after an intense series of difficult fights, I think it was 10 fights in 8 days or something, he was selected for the first ever Irish Olympic boxing team, which of course was the team that was to go to Paris in 1924. But before he went off to Paris, he had a life-changing encounter. He was invited to a dinner party in Merrion Square in Dublin as a guest of the artist Frances Baker. And she used to have these glittering soirees full of people from the artistic and literary circles of Dublin. And the writer James Stephens was another guest. and he introduced Robert to Francis Baker's young English niece, who was visiting from Surrey in southern England. So here she is, here's Rosemary with one of her Samoyeds. She bred Samoyeds. She was 18, Robert was 19, they were both very young, and from very, very different backgrounds. And in many ways they would never fully understand each other, but at this first meeting there was immediate mutual attraction. So in July 1924, Robert went off to the Olympic Games in Paris, and the book goes into a lot of detail about what happened there. But sadly, it all culminated in a defeat for Robert in the second round by the Argentine bantamweight champion. He left Paris the morning after this defeat, and he travelled all day by train and cross-channel ferry to Gumshaw in Surrey, where Rosemary lived, in a big house with her mother and aunts and grandmother. And he didn't actually find the house until quite late at night, so it's too late to knock at the door. So luckily he had a tent with him, and he put it up in the garden, and he camped in the garden overnight, and that's where Rosemary's Aunt Madeline found him in the morning, to her complete amazement. And she went running into the house, and she said, "There's an Irishman in the garden, and he wants to speak to Rosemary." And he came in, and they don't seem to have thought any the worse of him for his odd arrival. And of course, he absolutely charmed them, all of them. He brought Rosemary a special present from Paris, which was a copy of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, translated into French. And a love affair between the two of them blossomed very quickly. And he stayed for several days on that visit, and after that he kept coming back for more visits. It was a great relief to him to meet Rosemary. She'd been active in support of the Popular Rates Rebellion, which was a highly successful popular revolt in East London against government austerity. It was a huge thing in East London at the time. They did actually win the change in the rating system that they were fighting for, which proved to Robert that working people can fight back and win, and he hadn't seen that happen since his school days in Cork. And it's at this stage, I think, that the seeds were planted in Robert's school days, kind of took root, and under Rosemary's influence, he took up many of her socialist ideas. Rosemary espoused a very sort of moralistic kind of Christian socialism, believing that social justice and a fair society would be achieved by the Labour Party from the top. So we're not talking about, Marxism from below or anything like that. We're talking about, electing a Labour government who will do everything. Robert admired her enormously, as he would later make clear in one of his few surviving letters. He felt that she embodied a new hope for him. He no longer believed there was any future for him in Ireland, and at this point everything gave way for him to the desire to be with Rosemary. He dropped out of his degree course, and by 1926 he was living and working in London. Later that year we hear of his mother coming over to fix up a wedding. She pops up in the visitors book. The wedding had to be well away from Rosemary's posh Surrey neighbours because, embarrassingly, Rosemary was pregnant, and the story told back in Ireland was that she was a splendid girl from a very good family, and that Robert would now become a responsible, respectable family man. So the next question is, what went wrong, and how did Robert try to fix it? Part 5 of the book is called Married Love, and I wrote it in close consultation with Robert's eldest daughter, my mother Deirdre, and I found it one of the most heartrending sections to write. Incidentally, the picture on the front cover of the book that we began with is a picture taken at about this time, 1926. Telling me the story of Robert's married life brought a lot of painful memories to the surface for my mother. The unwanted pregnancy got the marriage off to a terrible start. Rosemary felt very ashamed and humiliated by it. She came from a rather upper crust colonial background family, and she always felt she'd been married down by marrying into the Hilliards because they'd made their money in trade. And she had a very difficult birth with her oldest child, Tim, and she was ill for a long time. Essentially, she and Robert grew apart. He was going off to work as a journalist in London every day, and she was stuck at home, sad and ill, an unwilling mother of a very new baby. And the political optimism that had drawn them together faded quickly. The betrayal and the defeat of the general strike in 1926 brought terrible hardship for many ordinary people and deep political disillusionment. And there's also, it has to be said, there's no doubt that Robert behaved appallingly to Rosemary at this time. This book is not a hagiography. I don't set out to paint him as any kind of saint, and he certainly wasn't during the early years of his married life. He espoused this sort of horribly male chauvinistic, journalistic lifestyle, and he gave Rosemary every reason to be terribly unhappy. I'll have to encourage you to read the full story of this part of his life for yourselves, but suffice to say that in the end, after their second child was born, who's my mother, Deirdre, he was consumed by guilt and a kind of reckless shame. He lost the family their home, the marriage fell apart, and then somehow he managed to pull it all back together. And he wrote a letter to Rosemary, to a relative of Rosemary's, her uncle Louis, at this time, which it starts with his own self-disgust at how he had behaved, but then it goes on to describe an astonishing moment on the top of a London bus, when he believed God was speaking to him and shining a light into his soul. And this moment of religious epiphany drew him into an evangelical cult called the Oxford Group, run by an American called Frank Buchman. And Rosemary was delighted by his conversion, and they both joined the Oxford Group. And they were not only reconciled with each other, but fell deeply back in love. And Robert decided to become a priest and return to Trinity College. The two of them had a very happy couple of years, but they soon ran into financial difficulties. I'll take these in a different order. This is Robert while he was a priest, on the way to the christening of his two youngest children, which he conducted himself, which happened in 1933. But just to take you up to that year, after gaining his degree in divinity in 1931, Robert was appointed deacon at Christ Church in Derryachi, which is a church some of you may know. It's just up the road. It was only a half-time post, and it brought in little or no money. And he still had to study for his divinity testimonial, which he gained in 1932. When he was finally ordained a few days later, he became curate at the same church in Derryachi. And again, it was only half-time with almost no pay. Even when he was appointed to a full-time curacy at St Anne's Cathedral in Belfast, he was only paid £25 a year. So I'd just like to pause there and stress that, because £25 a year is a bit more than it would be now, but it was a drop in the bucket for a man who by that time had 4 children. You can't possibly support a family of 6 on that. The Church of Ireland was a wealthy institution, but I think most of its young clerics came from relatively well-heeled backgrounds. It expected young clergy making their way to be supported by their families or by their parishioners while they got started. And unfortunately for Robert, it was the height of the Depression. His central Belfast parish was desperately impoverished. His father had died at the end of 1931. His family could no longer afford to give him the generous handouts of the past. And although he worked very hard, and cathedral records do show just how very hard he did work, he was a popular priest who attracted big congregations to St Anne's Cathedral with his eloquent sermons, but he was soon deep in debt. Rosemary again became very unhappy with Robert. She was worn out by the rapid succession of pregnancies that she'd endured, and after their 4th child was born, the doctors told her she mustn't have any more children. She hated living in poverty. The anxieties about money bred lots of rows and arguments between them. So in this picture, you've got Robert Rosemary and Davnet. Davnet is his second daughter. He's carrying her. You can't see the little baby, Kit, who had just been born, and you can't see my mum or Tim, the other children, but they were there. You can see, I think, the tension on the faces of Rosemary and Robert, and I think the distance between them, the growing emotional distance between this married couple, I think, is reflected in the physical distance as they walk down that pavement. You can see all is not well in that picture. As well as their personal troubles, there were dramatic events in Belfast which made it difficult for Robert to continue as a priest. Thousands of shipyard workers had been laid off, both Protestant and Catholic. Robert's two eldest children remember him taking, well, they've described to me, him taking them on his pastoral visits to very hard-up families, sometimes taking them bags of coal because they couldn't afford to put a fire in the grate, or food, the sight of unemployed men on street corners. In 1932, there were massive protests among Belfast's unemployed, and you can see, I mean massive. These protests united Catholic and Protestant unemployed, including many of Robert's parishioners, in a very justifiable fury, which Robert would have completely sympathised with, against the pitifully inadequate forms of unemployment relief. And after pitched battles on the streets of Belfast, these people did win some significant victories. However, the Church of Ireland opposed these protests, collaborating with police in attempts to clamp down on protesters, which were pretty brutal attempts. You know, people were shot, these crowds were attacked. Robert became deeply disillusioned, both with the Church of Ireland, which he'd hoped to reform. He'd hoped to make it into a more responsive and sensitive organisation. And he was realising now that is not going to happen. And he also became disillusioned with the Oxford group because its leader, Frank Buchmann, by this time was touring Germany, trying to meet Adolf Hitler, who he wanted to recruit to the Oxford movement. Frank Buchmann believed that fascism was something that he could work with. You know, this would have been anathema to Robert, who was rapidly becoming, his ideas were moving very much to the left, and he was fiercely anti-fascist. It's been hard hearing from my mother about the emotional insecurity the children endured as they realised their parents' marriage was falling apart. It had obviously now become a celibate marriage because Rosemary couldn't have any more children. Rosemary and Robert disagreed about the Oxford group and many other issues, and as I say, they were having these constant rows. By 1934, their debts were overwhelming them. Robert's creditors were quite literally banging on the door. So he applied for a loan from the church. And this is a big story that my mother tells of how the dean refused the loan. And that just brought complete despair because he didn't know where else to turn. So after a few more weeks, he left his church post to go to London at the start of 1935, hoping that he could get back into journalism and at least earn some more money. You know, the idea was that he would send it back. I think he also had ideas that he would be declared a bankrupt. And Rosemary used to talk about him as a bankrupt, but in fact he never was declared bankrupt. If he had been, it would have relieved the family of the debts. And Rosemary and the children were completely grief-stricken by the separation and by his departure, and hoped he would come back to live with them again at some point in the future. And part 6, which is the final part of the book, covers Robert's time in London and Spain. One of the first things Robert did when he got to London was to join the Communist Party, which shows how fast he'd been moving to the left while in Belfast. He and Rosemary kept up a friendly correspondence, and he told her all about his new political commitments, as we can learn from her own letters back to him, where she asks all about it. What did the Communist Party do at that time? And it was involved in supporting strikes, in fighting homelessness, in opposing evictions, opposing fascism. Robert was unemployed, he was broke, he was hungry, he was ragged, his health was suffering, but he threw himself into political activism. MI5 used to send spies to Communist Party meetings, and there's a report describing Robert as a prominent CP member. So you can guess that he was just as vocal and as active and full of enthusiasm as a Communist Party member as he had been in every other stage of his life. This was all going on against a background of gathering political crisis and economic instability across Europe. The shadow of fascism and war threatened every country, and something that would have influenced Robert very strongly was the battles in the streets of London against the Black Shirts. On the 4th of October 1936, there was a crucial battle at Cable Street in London. Oswald Mosley wanted to lead his Black Shirts into Whitechapel, which was the heart of East London's Jewish community. The police escorted Mosley and attacked the counter-demonstrators. In the face of this intimidation, Jews, non-Jews, communists, women, men, trade unionists, ordinary people from the East End stood in the path of the Black Shirts and stopped the march from going into Whitechapel. And the police then attacked the counter-demonstrators. There was a pitched battle with hundreds of people wounded, and the Black Shirts were forced to retreat. The police had to escort them away. This outcome was a major blow to the Black Shirts. They still held mass rallies after that, for a long time after that, but as their credibility began to wither, their funding from wealthy people in the United Kingdom and fascists abroad like Mussolini withered as well. Cable Street and other similar battles are why fascism was never able to get the same strong grip in the UK as it did in many other European countries. And I would argue that it actually presents us with quite a good model to learn from. The exception to the sweep of fascism across Europe was Spain. During 1936, Spain became the focus of hope and inspiration for the international left because there was a huge revolutionary upsurge by Spanish workers and peasants to resist a coup by Spain's military generals. Many ordinary people decided they wanted to go and fight alongside these Spanish workers, and many joined the international brigades from Britain. Others volunteered to fight with other organisations to the left of the Communist Party, such as the POUM, P-O-U-M, which stands for Partido Obrero Unido Marxista. That's basically what those initials stand for. Ultimately, Robert would go too. And in December 1936, he renewed his passport and left for Spain, travelling to Paris via Dunkirk. On the 21st of December 1936, he took the famous Red Train in Paris with many other volunteers from many other countries. It was a cold, overcrowded journey to Perpignan, where they all slept in a ruined chateau, and where Robert found time to buy a postcard and dash off an upbeat but very discreet message to Rosemary. Dear Mummy, this is where I am today, tomorrow elsewhere, quite safe and well. See you in a month or two. Love, Robert. You can tell a lot of things from this brief postcard. Firstly, he was unable to say exactly where they were or where they were going because there was an agreement between France, Britain and a number of other countries, which meant that they were stopping people from going to fight in Spain, so it was important not to give away what the route was and so on. But it also is so upbeat, it's quite clear he thought he was coming back. From Perpignan, volunteers made the long, winding journey into Spain, over the Pyrenees, on lorries and buses, under cover of darkness and in conditions of intense secrecy. And Robert wrote a detailed account of his time in Spain, which starts with an account of this journey. And he wrote it all down in a long letter, which was eventually published in the Trinity College magazine. He describes the high spirits on the lorries as they arrived in Spain. They had 4 hours sleep and breakfast in a place called Figueras, and they then took the train to Barcelona. In Barcelona, Robert found that a Spanish Revolution was in full swing. As I say in the book, he'd had a taster of this revolutionary spirit in Cork, when the working class in Ireland briefly held the balance of power in 1919. And arriving in Barcelona was an overwhelming experience for him, as he experienced that same excitement and optimism again. New volunteers were given an ecstatic reception by huge crowds, chanting and cheering and waving banners. "We marched through Barcelona," he reports. What a march! And he describes what the march was like and somebody he saw on the march. Again, I haven't got time to read you a whole long passage from the book, but it was clear that he was intensely moved by this experience. That's what he might be. And he's not the only person who's written an account of Barcelona in those years. There are some others which I quote from in the book, which goes on to describe how they were then taken first to the headquarters of the International Brigades in Albacete, and then to Madrigueras, where the British battalion of the 15th International Brigade was formed. And while researching this part of the book, I travelled across Spain. I went to Albacete, I went to Madrigueras, where they trained. I went to the Pingarrón Heights above the Jarama River, where he fought and where he was fatally wounded on the 14th of February 1937, 89 years ago, more or less this week. On to Castellón, the town hundreds of miles away, where he was taken after the battle, where he died in hospital, to the cemetery in Castellón, where he was buried, although Franco's regime felt unable to allow people like Robert to stay in their graves. So like tens of thousands of other people, he was dug up and thrown into a mass grave. And I sometimes felt I could hear his voice quite clearly while I was writing this part of the book, partly because I'd found this long letter from him that I've already mentioned, and partly because he wrote this rather amazing postcard. Here it is. He wrote this rather amazing postcard home before he went into battle at Jarama. He'd only got a few minutes to write this. There was a delegation waiting for them to write their postcards and take them away. He was writing in a muddy square in a rundown Spanish town with just a little bit of pencil. It's all in pencil. Sometimes people do find exactly the right words, and he found them in this postcard. It reached his wife, though his children did not see it, weeks and weeks after his death. And it says, among other things, "I still hate fighting, but this time it has got to be done. Unless fascism is defeated in Spain and in the world, it will be war and hell for our kids." So what I've tried to do, I hope I've done what I promised, which is to give you a small flavour of each one of the 6 parts of the book. And I've had to leave some colossal gaps, I'm afraid, but we will have time for questions and answers afterwards. So store up your questions if you've got any. If there's anything you want to ask more about, or that you feel I haven't covered or need to say more about, here I am. But before I finish, I'd like to say that when I told Robert's story in this book, I wanted it to be an anti-fascist book. It's dedicated on its flyleaf to all those resisting fascism then and now. And Robert Hilliard's words in that postcard, they almost come back to haunt us because they are as true now as they were then. Fascism does mean war and hell for our kids, and it does have to be defeated. And I think, the times we're going through now bear some marked resemblance to the 1930s because we're witnessing the spread of ridiculous lies and hatred against migrants and Muslims, just like the sort of things that the black shirts and the blue shirts actually in Ireland, the things they used to say to spread hatred of Jews. And it's urgent that we resist the current moves by the far right here in Ireland, Northern Ireland, in Bristol, the UK city where I live, and where where a mob of fascists actually are planning to stage a march through my home city of Bristol next weekend. Across Europe, in the United States, these people want to dominate our streets. They want to, the boot boys want to take over the streets, basically, like they did in the 1930s, and force us into acquiescence and shape political life. So unlike the 1930s, there is a difference, because this time round, we do know where it leads and what it means. We do have organisations mustering resistance, like Lekela and United Against Racism in Ireland, and Stand Up to Racism in the UK. And we have examples of how to fight back, and I've mentioned one of them. Just to mention a few, Cable Street, which I was talking about earlier, in the 1930s. In South London, we had the Battle of Lewisham against the National Front in the 1970s, and playing out still in Minneapolis, where people power in the streets has forced President Trump to announce that he's going to withdraw ICE from that city. And it's worth noting that the moment when the situation changed in Minneapolis was when workers there went on a mass strike, which perhaps underlines some of the points that I was trying to make earlier. We do have that power to go on strike, to go on demonstrate against fascists, to stop them marching, and to stop this whole new generation of the far right from taking over our streets and governments. So I want to end by saying that I really do believe that if Robert Hilliard was here tonight, he would be saying this too. You know, they shall not pass. We have to say it again, no passaran. So I'll stop there, but I'm here to answer any questions that you may have.
Living in Britain and England, say, who do you think he would vote for?
Who do I think he would vote for?
Yes.
Well, to be honest, I think he'd find it, in the UK, I think he'd find it very difficult. I think he would be getting behind any campaign to stop the far right, going by the record in his own lifetime. And I think he would also think that it was not just about the vote. You know, there he was in London, involved in all these campaigns. They didn't just sit back and say, who are we going to vote for? They went out there, they marched to stop the fascists. They marched to help people picket workplaces when they were on strike. When somebody was being evicted from their home, they would all go into the house and make it impossible for the bailiffs to repossess it. This was basic organised grassroots activity, and I would think that he would be saying, we need to do some of that, because, you know, only when people make a different reality can you turn back what's happening. But he would also, I think he would find it infuriating and disturbing, as I do, the rhetoric of politicians who think that the way to counter the far right is to agree with them and to go along with all this terrible stuff, divisive stuff. I think people need to stand together, and I think, you know, Robert would have had the same sympathy for migrants as he had for Egyptians, as he had for working people everywhere.
You say in your book, Lynn, that there were increasing scepticism on Robert's part about the communists in Spain and how they were treating the brigadiers, which was part of his sort of character to be anti-authoritarian and sceptical of authority. For example, the Church of Ireland, he thought was too hidebound. Had he survived longer in Spain, do you think those difficulties with the communists would have deepened, and might there have been more trouble? Like a lot of men from Ireland were badly treated by the CP and received very bad reports and were detained at times, allegedly for drunkenness, but often because they kicked against the traces of communist orthodoxy.
Well, I'll start quickly by saying two things. This is obviously, like the last question, it's a bit speculative. I can only give a speculative answer because he wasn't, let's face it, he wasn't there very long. He only lived in Spain for, 3 months after he got there. So the events that happened later that George Orwell describes, for example, in Homage to Catalonia, were still, they hadn't happened yet. But it did reach a point, where people these were volunteers. They'd come to Spain of their own volition to help people, were sometimes even executed for supposedly being Trotskyists or dissenters or whatever. Now, I think you're slightly, if I may say so, I think you're slightly over-egging what I say in the book, because I don't say that Robert was sceptical. I have to speculate, because I've only got a little bit to work with, but it is true that in this letter home that he wrote, this long letter, he writes at enormous length about something that was clearly very much on his mind, which is the way that democracy functioned in the international brigades. And he says, some of us had thought we were joining a Red Army where we would elect our own officers. Now, in the POUM, in some of the other fighting units that were battling it in Spain at this time, they did elect their own officers. And a lot of people, well, some people came out to Spain expecting to do so. And the fact that he uses the word we does imply that he was one of them. But he's sort of wrestling with this in the letter, and he says, well, this is a democratic army, but it's not a revolutionary army. I can't remember the exact words, but he's sort of saying there's this kind of democracy and there's that kind of democracy. And in fact, there are other chroniclers of life in the brigades. For example, a very famous writer about, he wrote a book called Crusade in Spain, a man called Jason Gurney, which I do recommend to you, where he talks about the double vision, the way that people used to have these great long discussions about what they should do in the international brigades. They had all these little discussion groups where they'd all get together and we should be doing this and we should be doing that. But ultimately the authority came very, very much from the top. It's fair to say that the Comintern, the Communist International, did not want to see a revolutionary army forming in Spain. They didn't want to see a Spanish Revolution. And this is a huge topic that you've opened up here. So I can't really say more about it. But there's some evidence that every now and then Robert's discretion would leave him. He would have a lot of wine to drink and he would start making this sign of the cross where he, in the name of Marx, Lenin, Stalin, Dimitrov, Stakhanov, two of the most controversial characters operating at that time. Again, there's a lot of background to this which I urge you to read. But it was clear that he was having a very... it was funny, he was being very funny, people remember this, but there was something else there as well as humour. And I think that's as far as I could go. Who knows what would have happened had he lived longer?
I would like to know what happened to his wife and family.
Well, actually, I think one of my favourite reviews of the book, it really touched me that she wrote this. It's by a journalist called Clodagh Finn, who wrote a very nice review in the Irish Examiner, in which she said I'd written the women back into the story, because the book really does talk a lot about his wife and his family, what it was like for them, what happened to them. And of course, the way I know so much of this is from my mother, and from her mother too while she was alive, but very much from my mother, who wrote, in 2004, sat down to write a memoir of her own. It's just a private family thing, which she doesn't want published, but which I had it there as a tremendous resource, and it did give me a lot of information. And the women in the family were really the backbone of the family. I don't think Rosemary and the children could have survived without Rosemary's mother, who used to make sure that the children went to school. They had a terrible time with these moves from, to these various derelict cottages. They ended up in Falmouth, where life got a little bit easier because they were in a slightly less tumble-down house, where they at least had, plumbing, heating, furniture, They grew up in due course. Rosemary sadly fell into a deep depression. She never really got over Robert's departure, but there had been, it's fair to say, a lot of betrayals in her life, and I do say quite a lot in the book about her childhood, which explains the kind of person she was. I think it really does. So was it you wanted to know about Rosemary or about the children or all of them? Well, they were. What happened was that Robert's mum didn't have much money at this time. She'd lost her husband, and she had, when they sold up the family, their share of the family business, a lot of it had been bought up by Robert Senior's brother, who died in the same year, his brother John, was now by far the wealthier of the two men. So she wasn't all that well off, but what she did manage to do was she invested a little bit of money in a trust fund, which gave the family £2 a week, and they lived on that, £2 a week. So they lived on, it's in the book, I think it was herrings at a penny, mackerel at twopence. They used to soft boil eggs and then cut these soft boiled eggs into sort of fractions to give out among the children. And every now and then the kids would be sent to a school. They went to a school in Lisbon. The two eldest children, my mum Deirdre and Tim, were sent to the Friends School in Lisbon. And the wonderful thing about the Friends School, two wonderful things. One was that the teachers were very kind, and these children needed a bit of kindness by this time. But they also needed some feeding up. The school had wonderful lunches. So they would go to school and they would eat everything they could possibly get their hands on at lunchtime and make it last the day. I'm not sure that it would be a very long story to tell you the ins and outs of everything that happened to all of them forever after. But again, I commend the book to you because it does. If anybody does want to know about all the people in the family, you will find it out there.
Could I just make a comment? I suppose you could have a debate here on the Spanish Civil War and the role of the different political groups on the Republican side, and that's a controversial matter, and you can look back and you can have your own views. The one thing you can be said is that it was the communist parties across Europe and elsewhere that actually organised mainly the international brigades themselves, as opposed, I know the POUM and the anarchists had their own means of getting people to Spain, it wasn't. There were no communists in the Spanish government at the time. This was a left-wing democratic government, and there's an argument there that what they were fighting for wasn't a revolution, but was for the maintenance of democracy, and that was one of the big arguments at the time. But I mean, it's an intriguing story. I first learned about Robert Hilliard through a book by a guy called Michael O'Riordan, who was the General Secretary of the Communist Party in Ireland, who fought in Spain. He was from Cork as well, and he had originally been in the IRA. His book's called The Connolly Column. It was a book about the Irishmen who fought in Spain, and Robert Hilliard gets a considerable mention. This book, it's been republished, so it has. I think there's been 2 editions of it. And there's other books. There's one by Bob Doyle, and there's one by Peter O'Connor from Waterford, and all these people were active trade unionists, so they were fighting for workers' rights in Ireland, and they ended up going to Spain. Some didn't come back, like Robert and others fortunately did. But it's an intriguing story, so it is. Whenever you start speculating about what would have happened or what views he would have taken, I think it's a bit of a barren argument, I suspect,
Well, I did say, how far can you get with speculation? I agree. Yes, it was the Communist Party who organised the international brigades, and certainly it was always said that what the international brigades were setting out to achieve was the upholding of the Popular Front government, not a Spanish revolution. What is said by some writers, including I mentioned Jason Gurney, is certainly one of them. He said it very forcefully, that it was the upsurge of working class revolt in Spain which had carried the day in pushing back the generals. So I do try to, I don't know if you nobody here is obliged to read my book, and I don't know if you have, but I do try and sort of engage with the very important debate that you have brought up there in the book. And there is certainly a point of view that would argue, and was argued, and is argued, that once you stand down the Spanish Revolution, really the Popular Front government is not going to win, because looking for help from the French governments, the British government, looking for help from abroad was never going to happen, People had to depend on their own resources, on a fight back from below. And while it was a revolutionary struggle, I would argue that the momentum was forward. And when that was stood down, when that was paused, I mean, ultimately, we have to say the International Brigades and the Popular Front were defeated. And Franco did win. So the strategy was not a winning strategy, as events proved, sadly. None of which is to take away the heroism of the International Brigadistas, the incredible generosity of spirit that will take people from all these different countries to Spain to defend to defend the Spanish people against the generals as they did. It is an amazing story to look back on. And we will be commemorating the Battle of Jarama next weekend in Spain. And it will be it's something that we must not forget. This is a story we have to keep telling. Sometimes people say, we can never have change for the better because human nature is selfish. And I sort of think, well, look at the story of the International Brigades. Actually, human nature is not selfish. People are capable of doing these wonderful, generous, spirited things.
Lynn, can I thank you once again for this evening? It's been a fascinating insight into your grandfather and the communists and all that happened. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you for asking me. Thank you for coming.